6. We're live on DSTV channel 421, GoTV channel 125, across all our social media handles. We're Journeys on TV. Coming up within the next 60 minutes, John Mahama's transition team says it has blocked the payment of over 240 million Ghana cedis to an entity that had conducted business with the electricity company of Ghana.
Information. Indeed, we've seen documentation relating to efforts to pay over 240 million Ghana cedis to an entity that is supposed to have done some business with the electricity company of Ghana.
We have details as President-elect John Dramani Mahama disagrees with President Akufo-Addo's assertion that the economy has returned to the pre-COVID era of growth. Well, this morning also, we have a conversation with a man who has served on two transition teams. He is the former Finance Minister, Setekpe, and is our guest this morning on News 6. Also coming up, 3 feared dead, others in critical condition and receiving treatment at Winneba Trauma Hospital following an accident at Goma in the Central Region. We have details of this and more here on News 6. Please take a seat, be my guest. Thanks for choosing us. We are your home of independent, fearless, incredible journalism. Now, let's start with the transition team. The Mahama's transition team says it has blocked the payment of more than 240 million Ghana cedis to an entity that had conducted business with the electricity company of Ghana. Well, according to the team, the payment is being withheld pending further discussion by the joint transition team on Friday. While addressing the media after the first day of the transition process, Felix Kwachiofosu, spokesperson for the incoming government side, stated that they raised serious concerns over outgoing and ongoing last-minute recruitments and payments being made by the outgoing administration.
Worrying issue of last-minute recruitments and payments. I'm sure you have heard of various last-minute, rather irregular recruitments in some ministries, departments, and agencies, Bank of Ghana, GRA, the Ministry of Interior, and what have you. We need to place on record that these recruitments, especially regarding the time that they are being made, would have severe fiscal implications for the incoming government. For instance, we have picked up information. Indeed, we've seen documentation relating to efforts to pay over 240 million Ghana cedis to an entity that is supposed to have done some business with the electricity company of Ghana. Now, if this was being paid to IPPs so that they could keep the power on, one perhaps would not have any issue. But it is being paid to an entity whose work, in my view, is not as critical as IPPs. Now, this sort of payment is quite huge and would affect the public purse in a manner that could be detrimental if not regularly done. So the NDC side of the transition team requested that this payment be put on hold pending further scrutiny and discussion to ascertain, first of all, the basis for the payments and whether or not it is even proper to make such a payment. I think that good governance requires that the incoming government is given the opportunity to make these decisions. Elsewhere, governments do not operate in this manner. In the twilight of a government, you do not commit the incoming government to some of these things, especially because of the precarious state of our finances. It would be highly irregular and improper to saddle the incoming government with these payments. So we raised strong objection to these maneuverings and requested that they be put on hold. The government side agreed to put it on hold pending further discussions at the next meeting of the transition team on Friday, and we will forcefully insist that this is done. There is precedent. In December 2016, 17 December 2016, and a letter to that effect was read by a member of the NDC side of the transition team. The MPP side, through Mr. Osafo, requested that any such commitments regarding recruitments or payments be made only with the express approval of the incoming government. So we are surprised that that same precedent is not being adhered to.
Well, meanwhile, President-elect John Dramani Mahama, during Wednesday's inauguration of the Joint Transmission Team, appeared to disagree with President Akufo-Addo's assertion that the economy has returned to the pre-COVID era of growth. Well, President Akufo-Addo had expressed optimism about the economy bouncing back during the event at the Accra International Conference Center. However, in his response, John Dramani Mahama urged the Joint Transmission Team to work within a modest budget, citing the current economic challenges. Marshall Wawa once again with this report.
Let me first of all welcome you very, very warmly.
John Mahama was accompanied to the Jubilee House by the Vice President-elect Professor Nana Jane Opoku-Agyeman, co-chairperson Julius Deborah, and other members of the incoming government side of the transition. In his speech, President Akufo-Addo said for the first time Ghana has a female vice president. It is something the people must be proud of. He assured the president-elect of his full support and cooperation during this transitional period.
I want particularly to congratulate our historic lady, the first female vice president in our history. To say, madam, well done, and all of us are wishing you the very best of luck. You've become a trailblazer for lots of women, and it's an important step that has been taken. I believe we're back to where we began in 2017. It was the same venue, yes, whereby we were in reverse positions. Yes. Yeah. Also, take the opportunity to reassure the Ghanaian people of our determination to work together to ensure the seamless transfer of power, to continue to work together to deepen and consolidate democratic governance in our country.
President-elect John Mahama said the Joint Transition Team is going to work together in the interest of Ghana for a seamless transition.
Democracy, and Ghana is the winner after the electoral process. We think that on the day, despite all the anxieties people had, Ghana has successfully done it once again. And so we can be sure that our democracy is safe, and that working together across bipartisan lines, we can continue to deepen and consolidate that democracy.
Later at Accra International Conference Center, there was the inauguration of the Joint Transition Team. In his speech, President Akufo-Addo said the economy has returned to the pre-COVID era of growth, expressing confidence that the economy is back to what it was like in his first term.
President-elect, Your Excellency, you'll be happy to learn that the Minister of Finance has just informed me on my way here that the third quarter results of the economy has been established at a growth of 7.2%, making an average rate of the growth of the first three quarters at 6.3%. We are indeed back to the pre-COVID era of growth in my first term.
But President-elect John Mahama seemingly disagreed with the president, urging the Joint Transition Team to work with a modest budget considering the current economic situation.
We call on the transition team to work expeditiously and within a modest budget, given the prevailing economic circumstances. Even though Mr. President seems to strike a very upbeat tone on recent numbers, I'm sure the transition team would establish that. Mr. President, you can count on my respect and cooperation during and even after this transition. We must demonstrate to the world that despite the adversity we face, Ghana remains the beacon of democracy in Africa. We pray that the members of the Joint Transitional Team will work within the confines of this law to fulfill the wishes of the Ghanaian people as expressed in the votes of 7th December 2024.
Well, this morning here on NewsDesk, we're putting the issues into perspective as we look at the work of the Joint Transmission Team. We've been joined in the studio by a man who has worked on 2 transition teams. He's also a former finance minister, said Tekpe. Thank you so much for your time here on Newsdesk.
Welcome.
I'm looking forward to the role you'll be playing in the next administration. Do you want to hint us on what we should expect? Would you still be in the finance ministry?
The cabinet and other ministers are appointed by the president. And so until you get a call, it will be a very bold person. Say that
Have you received any calls so far? Because I know lobbying is going
I've been working
underground.
No, not that particular call, but you know, I've been working, you know, on various issues, particularly on the economic side, you know, manifesto and others. So, but no call yet.
No calling yet.
No.
Well, I'm sure we'll be finding out shortly. But I'm quite interested in having this conversation about the transmission team because you have served on 2 different transmission teams, 2009 and 2012. How different is the dynamics this time?
We are talking about a process that is legislated and it's under law now.
Yeah.
It used to be administrative, many things, such as the Public Financial Management Act, which many provisions are now, you know, legislated when the improvement in the Financial Administration Act, you know, was done.
In 2012?
So in 2012.
Yeah.
So that tells you that it's not an amendment act. So it tells you that the first time it came into existence under late President Mills, probably from his experience, you know, had this idea that it should be properly regulated. You see that most of it is consistent with the Constitution. The Constitution covers, you know, election, you know, to be held on December 7th in the absence of, and if there's a runoff, December, I believe it's 28th, it must be done. And then it also states that the handing over must be done on December 7th. So you have this tight, you know, 1 month, you know, within which the new the president-elect, you know, who, in the case of President Mahama, he has had experience in government, but it could be somebody who has not run the executive, you know, before. In order to make the past experiences a bit more streamlined, the law, you know, was passed. And it's not a big law. It has 14, you know, provisions.
Yeah, so let's delve into it. If you just tune in, we're referring to the Presidential Transition Act, and that was passed in 2012. It's Act 845. Yeah. Now, let's look at the key provisions about the establishment of a transition team and what their key role would be.
Precisely.
Tell us more about that.
Yes, so since we have the law, I think I would use the law as background. You know, it makes it authoritative and it makes it, you know, so that the experience within this, you know, you see that it wasn't present during my first participation, but present during the second participation. So that's the difference for me. So the parts, there are 1, 2, 3 parts. So maybe we want to take them in parts.
Okay.
The first part is the transition team.
Which has been inaugurated.
Which has been inaugurated. And that is covered by section 1 to 5. And it requires that for the, let me read, an act to establish arrangements for the political transfer of administration from one democratically elected president to another democratically elected president to provide for regulation and political transfer of power and for related matters. So it seeks to just streamline, you know, and further on it talks about where the president succeeds himself. As in the case of the last administration, there's still a requirement. So it means that if we go back to 2020, even though the incumbent president won the elections, you know, since this was the first time, one of the things that was tested was the president handing over to himself. His old administration handing over to the new administration.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, as with your question, there's no guarantee that because you served, you know, previous administration, even if you are going to be running, you know, it's a process that must be followed.
A similar thing happened in 2012 because John Mahama, the then vice president under Atta Mills' government, when Atta Mills passed, had to take the role as president, and then he contested and won again. So it was like transitioning from the same government to the same government.
There's a slight, yes, in principle then, but that was also the first time the law was being tested. And in principle, President Mahama was serving the remaining term for the late President Mills because of the period that was left to the end of the election. I think it's 6 months, if it's before. So, and that is why, even though, yes, he continued, won the elections, right, he served only, 4 years because he was deemed to have served 1 term. Oh, sorry. That's the reason why he's going to serve only 4 terms. Because that was also the first time. That principle of a vice president succeeding, a president was tested. And yes, so you're right. So he had to then conform in principle with this, hand over to himself.
Let's look at the key role they would be playing, because I know that each ministry would have to put together their handing over notes. The reason we're already hearing concerns from the likes of Felix Kwakye-Ofosu, the spokesperson for the incoming team, which is the NDC government, raising concerns about some last-minute projects slipping through. What should they be looking out for based on your experience?
The point he raised as another segment of his intervention was that this wasn't the first time. And he mentioned that, during the handover by President Mahama to now to incumbent President Nana Akufo-Addo, a similar warning was posted and even put in writing. He mentioned that then led by the senior, minister, wrote, a note of caution, to the old government, and I was witness to it, to freeze some expenditures, or certain actions that were being done. So the two which he cited were contracts, late in the day, and then he gave reason that we are in a very vulnerable situation, and it will be probably imprudent to award new contracts and things. And then there was a heavy load of new employees, which he also cited. Now, part of the reason is budgetary, right? We have because the elections take place in December, early December, and Parliament is the one that passes the budget. In every election year, it's impossible to pass the budget. So we do not have a 2025 budget, which would have been debated, been a debate by now. I mean, if we put the hang Parliament is used, aside. Yeah. So that is not occurring. So what it means that you are going to 2025, the new government, without a budget. The Constitution requires that what you call the expenditure in advance of that appropriations, Parliament that appropriates, the revenue, a quarter for January to March. So let's use, since we are going through it. So Parliament by now should have passed, that act to finance the government from January 2025 to March 2025. To allow, because it was not possible to pass the budget.
But with the unpassing Parliament, I'm sure this would affect that, although the Speaker says they will be meeting on the 16th.
Okay. Yes, I'll come to that.
Okay.
Yes. So I'll come to the implications of that, which is one of the reasons for caution.
Okay.
I was giving the reasons for caution.
Okay.
So there is no guarantee, for giving the stalemate, as you pointed out, for even having a January to March, budgetary provision, right? We'll come to that. Now the 2025 budget must be passed by the end of March 2025. So if, in principle, you do recruitments and others of that magnitude, you award contracts of that magnitude, you are worsening the situation where there may not be money to pay even, existing salaries, to pay above all. We don't want to default again, the interest payments that are due, loan repayments that are due, until the expenditure in advance of appropriation is passed and the budget itself is passed. Luckily, because the 2024 budget has been passed, we can be assured that the 2024 commitments, will be met because there's a provision for it. But there's no provision for 2025, right? So he also mentioned the situation in which, the country finds itself with defaults, with high deficits, an IMF program, and others, which are constraining, on expenditure. And so it is even more prudent compared to 2016, right, to be careful with respect to what expenditure commitments you are taking into the following year for these reasons. Now, to your point, if the hung parliament situation continues, because the old parliament is still sitting, and if it is resolved, then we would have money for January to March. If it is not resolved, then the possibility is that the new parliament, right, would have to pass an expenditure in advance of appropriation, for under certificate of, urgency to keep government running until the budget is read, by the new Minister for Finance before the end of March. So you see the
dynamics.
The dynamics exactly, and the fiscal situation in which, that statement was made. It made some political, but one, there's precedence, and two, these are the sort of dynamics that, to use a word, which were under consideration, in coming to that. Let us hope, as he said, that some discussion will be held. And the last time, some discussions were held, despite the letter that was received, because you cannot also, and the last time, it even concerned expenditures which were approved in the 2020, in the then 2016 budget, right? So, but there was some understanding that you can't stop payment of, interest payment for loans. You can't stop, because technically there are periods for making these payments, and you would have defaulted if you didn't pay. You couldn't also stop the payment of salaries which were due going to Christmas and others. So I believe that I see, the current chief of staff and the former chiefs of staff, they also have had experience with handing over. And I believe that the issue will be resolved, when, as indicated, the meeting is held on Friday.
Looking at your background, let's subject the president's description of the current state of the economy to scrutiny. He says that the economy is bouncing back post the pre-COVID era. Is that the case?
There are some positive signals, and even the IMF has said that there are positive signals. Growth used to be low. We've defaulted, and the IMF has issued, I don't know, even on your news this morning. Yeah. That's why I have not read it even yet, but I heard on the news this morning, clarification in your business news of the situation with the debt exchange, and other issues. So I think the point is that we have been in decline for quite some time. We defaulted. Our deficit is low. Growth has been low. So 2 points, which is why what President Mahama was clarifying. There was a professor, again this morning, or an analyst, who made a very important point on the news. I'm quoting, that's why maybe you can, listeners who listen to you, that certain sectors did not perform well, and they cited agri. So the growth we are talking about is headline. That is the average of, let's say, 4 or 5 sector growth, agri, financial services, and the rest. So the caution President Mahama was pointing to is that the headline, right, and it happens with most governments, the headline may be driven, by oil prices going up and others. The headline may be because of, let's say, industry, picking up. It could be. But if you look at the release, there are certain sectors which are still, quite suffering. So what he meant to state is that, yes, the current president may look at the headline, but that's only one index, to state boldly, that the economy, was back on the path of recovery. We still have vulnerabilities. And one of the major vulnerabilities in Ghana's economic analysis, mind you, this is historical figures based on the previous quarter. We are now going to the next quarter, which is the next quarter and the first quarter of every year is the most difficult period for Ghana. One, we have come out of the rainy season, right? Of course, our food storage, processing, preservation are not at that high level to say that even if you had bumper, harvest, there will be processed food, there will be storage and others to take you through. So whilst we move into this difficult position, we import, food to complement the local production on a higher scale. We also go into the festive season, where imports are also quite heavy, right? And then you enter the dry season, where virtually farming activities, come to a halt. And it is not until at the earliest April, May, that the rainy season begins, right? So, former President Mahama is looking at a situation where I am going to take the economy. And it's an economy which, okay, another point before I come to that, if you look at other indices, deficit is still high, we need to bring it down, even under the fund program. We are still struggling with even payment of the domestic debts on the haircuts that is due. We're struggling, in finalizing completely, the external debt exchange. And then, assuming that all this were done, based on the IMF, and the market data that is coming out, we have what we call HAMs, big debt repayments, which were suspended, which are falling due from 2026. Because 2027. Wow. Because that's agreement, right? Which will have to be handled. The last time we went through that was in 2013, 2014, which actually prompted the setting up of the sinking fund, because His Excellency President Kufuor, the bond that was issued during his time in 2007 was going to fall due in 2017, 3 years, to the then 2017 transition, right? Then we had a doomsaw, bonds that were issued also falling due 3-5 years. So you had to refinance, which is about and so he is looking at, one, the weather condition, two, the food situation in particular. And the food index is services has now overtaken it. But when it comes to, the pocket food, basic food is the thing. Cost of living, apart from transport and others. So that is the background, of President Mahama being seen, to not so contest, but saying it may be so, but going forward, we do have, these situations ahead of us, including the conditions in the IMF program, which needs to be met. Let's talk about the conditions in the IMF program, because John Mahama served notice that his government will consider reviewing the current program we are under. Some of the key concerns by individuals is that the current debt restructuring, by the time the next government takes effect, most of them would have elapsed. So you have a lot of debts you may have to cover. What key policy direction would you advise this government implement to help with our deficits? And also, if he's going to change the current IMF program and go and renegotiate, what should he be looking out for? I think we should again, like we did with the law, use the IMF program itself. Okay. As a backdrop. What is it that we are supposed to be meeting? Right? So I think that will be. And we have gone through the third review. Yeah. Now, there's precedence. The 2015 IMF program overlapped an election year, and the MPP took over, the program. We left buffers. You remember the sinking fund, the stabilization fund, and others. We know today that they are depleted. So again, that's another factor. We're not going to have that situation, despite 3 oil fields, right? We're supposed to be, like all IMF programs, we're supposed to be raising revenue. The biggest headache we have now is the domestic tax revenue, which is not performing too well. There was to be a digitalization, if I may use that word, or automation, which was not completed. In fact, there was just a tender, which was cancelled. Okay, so when you talk about revenue measures, tax measures, right, the platform on which it was going to be done on a broad basis, apart from the increase in levies and the rest, the main thing is the restructuring. Is still pending, and it will have to be rolled on. We know about expenditure. I'm picking the areas where, we have commitments under the IMF. We know expenditure is very high. We're supposed to be reducing it against the background where your revenue is not as buoyant as it should be, right? That leaves you with a big deficit, revenue minus expenditure. That's what we call a budget deficit. Because your expenditure, like a household, if your expenditure is higher than, your salary and your maybe mommy shopping and shops, maybe the families that have, say, taxes and the rest, you put all of that together, you may see your expenditure being higher, maybe because it's a semester, coming after Christmas and all that. So the nation finds itself in that situation. So we're supposed to raise revenue, reduce expenditure, so that we can reduce the deficit. Because the deficit is what you borrow. When you talk about financing the deficit, that is the deficit for which you are borrowing. But you've defaulted on previous loans that you took, which brings I'm trying to bring you to where, you came in again with, debt suspension and, and all of those commitments that we have, the debt exchange, some of which is due for payment and all that. So these are the broad conditions, but also the economy sometimes is not performing well because the sectors that have to, drive that economy, right? And you can imagine what comes to mind. Let's say Dumso, that's the one that comes to mind, right? Because if you do not have power running, right? If you are having the guarantees, those who are supplying fuel not being paid, and therefore they are calling their guarantees. And then when they call the guarantee, it means that the bank that guaranteed or whoever guaranteed, including the government, must find money to pay. Or now you are going to go into a second default situation, which will be too bad for us because we've had a default and we're supposed to be correct. And that is what is happening now. Now, when you don't have power, it means industry won't run well, right? It means, some business will have to close, roadside business will have to close early because, you don't have power. You come home and those who take work, or even right now we have a lot of people, including many young people, as you know, who, especially in the data field, are busy when others are sleeping, and they are working because the work they are doing is analyzing data, processing the data, which they send outside. That kind of work would also slow. But more importantly, industry, mining, and the rest. Okay, so we have these difficulties, which faces the economy. So these are the sort of things which President Mahama is going to take over, just as President Akufo-Addo took over the 2015 budget under better conditions, and with 3 oil fields, right? Now we know that we're not doing well despite 3 oil fields. So that is the context. What President Mahama is also saying about, of course, there's going to be a review anyway.
Why?
Yes, because
why is the current deal we are under deficit of some of the key things you feel the economy needs at this point? That you need a restructuring or you need a renegotiation?
Yes, that's what I'm coming to. So I have highlighted areas. So let's use one of the examples I gave. The Mama is going to inherit, Dumso, right? That is what the IMF knows now, that we are having power cuts, right?
We're having
the structural part of the IMF program includes commitments by government to improve, the energy situation so that the economy will work. Remember, they give us a loan. They're also interested in getting a loan. And if you don't get the economy working, you will not be able to meet their loan commitments, and you add to the debt which you have already defaulted. So what President Mahama is saying that our manifesto, right, has a path, to resolving Dumso, as I did in the past, right? So even though I'm taking over a commitment by Ghanaians, by government on behalf of Ghanaians, when I take over, I have a plan which I want you to consider based on my experience in resolving Dumso. I think IMF will want to listen to this because the period under which the fund program was agreed, was a period of difficulty. That difficulty is not resolving. But he's saying, I have been through this. I have brought badges, I brought whatever. And during the campaign, he said it, that we are going to talk to the oil companies, for example, to come back, those who have left for various reasons and the rest. So he's saying, I have an energy policy, right? Secondly, we don't seem to be raising enough revenue, which is why we are having difficulty in making the payments. I'm giving a second example. He is saying, I started the tax reforms. We did ICOMS, or single window, which is now ICOMS. That's the custom system. We were about to do the domestic system, right? And I have a plan for bringing that system in place, which has been suspended. I believe when he says this, and he's saying that this is in my, the IMF would have to, listen. This is happening globally, as far as the IMF, is concerned. Okay, to give a third example, he says expenditures are high, right? That's what's the IMF. We are supposed to reduce expenditure, right? He says on my campaign trail, I have given what I want to do with expenditure. Stop new contracts. I'm giving some examples. Tackle the pipeline. Doesn't matter who started it. Tackle the pipeline, because some of the pipeline has loans which have been taken to complete them, right? We'll find money to, to pay the contractors and the rest, so that we can keep the economy going. So more or less what he's saying is that I have experience. I have handled an IMF program, both as vice president and as president, right? And I have perspectives on what we agreed with you. So, and he's gone as far as saying, in the past, not just now, that he wants to enhance certain aspects of the IMF program, not renege on them. He rather wants to enhance them. And to give you an example, the prime criteria for, one of the prime criteria, there are several of them, for assessing whether the government is doing well or not, is what we call the primary balance. Remember we spoke about revenue minus expenditure and then deficit, okay? Now, when you use the primary, that's the fiscal deficit. When you use the primary balance, sorry for the jargon, I hope that I carry you along. In that expenditure, you are excluding interest payments, right? So it means that you are using what? A lower level of expenditure to compare with the revenue and saying that I'm doing well. Okay, assuming your revenue is 10, your expenditure is 8. Sorry, your expenditure is 8, your revenue is, just a moment, your revenue is 8, your expenditure is 10, your deficit is therefore 2, right?
Yeah.
Arithmetic. Now, you are changing that criteria, conventional criteria. Remember I said that the deficit is what you are borrowing.
Yeah.
Now, you are removing interest, which is probably 1 from the expenditure. So you are reducing the expenditure to 7 or 6 and compare it with, to 9 or so and compare it with, you are doing well, right? But he's saying, wait a minute. When I look at this criteria, you are taking out interest. You are not adding arrears. You are not adding my debt repayments. That is what that criteria leaves out. And yet my problem is debt. Right? He said, yes, my problem is debt. But in telling me I'm doing well, you are excluding interest payments to those from whom I borrowed. So when I come, we shall endeavor. It's a harder measure, but we shall endeavor to cover all the expenditure items, to make sure that we are doing well, even though it will be harder. One would have said, oh, yes, okay, yes, just exclude expenditure. Exclude that.
It means government would need more revenue. And that's going to be a key concern, because I'm just looking at Ghana's current IMF deal. And one of the key things that we sought to do was to restructure the debt owed bond holders, which is by $4.7 billion, and also provide cash relief for $4.4 billion. Now, these are all in dollars. So I'm thinking if you go back to the negotiation table, you are looking at doing a lot of restructuring of some of these debts, which by then payments would have elapsed. You're looking at fixing the energy sector, which you say is a problem. We know that to a large extent,
yes,
the issues in the energy sector is largely financially driven. The IPPs, they're complaining they don't have the money. ECG, finding it difficult to recollect the monies they have spent. So if you're going to be fixing all of this, it means you would need money. Does it mean the next administration will be borrowing more?
No, as I said earlier, would complete the revenue, reforms. Initially, there will be borrowing. It's inevitable. The current government is borrowing. There's problem even in, even for the T-bills. There are what you call auction shortfalls. When they bid, they don't get all the money. So yes, borrowing is inevitable, and it will continue. But then, as I said earlier on, the first thing is to make sure that the GRA systems for collecting revenue, the reform, some of which were stopped as part of setting up the GRA, we are going to move quickly to bring them on board. On expenditure, President Mahama has said that, hey, look, we all agree, our expenditure, is high. No question about it. I'm going to do a national consensus, a national forum. And he's adding that on these measures on the revenue side, I did West Blue, I did single window, I was to continue with this one. So I'm telling you, when he meets them, that we are going to do this, and I have the record of doing it. On debt, right, which we are talking about, he says, I am bringing the oil companies, and I have the record of setting up a sinking fund for debt repayment, right? And so when we bring the oil companies and we get more, revenue, when it flows through the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, you can cap, the stabilization fund, and that's what we use to pay down His Excellency Kufuor's sovereign bond, part of it, and we restructured. And he's saying, I've done this before.
Let me come in at this point.
He says, I've done this before, right? Which led to we going to the World Bank for 2 guarantees, the partial risk guarantee, which supported the oil, which we are talking about, which has collapsed, and then the loan guarantee, which has also collapsed under the debt restructuring. But he's saying, under my regime, I set it up. And I added, because I didn't think that it was going to be sufficient, I went to the public going into an election year in 2015, right, to impose a tax called ESLA, right, which was to help pay the IPPs and all that, right? It wasn't used, it was collateralized, it wasn't done. And he's saying, when I come, I'm going to look at the ESLA is still flowing. I have done it before. I'm going to look at, the ESLA, see what flows are coming from it, right? And sit down as we did with, look, let me inform you that before we left office, because of ESLA, there was an Afrism, term sheet, which was to be used to take loans, to pay, the oil company, just as the VRA loan was settled. But what was done was that the loan, even though it was for VRA and the payment was going to VRA, it was actually given to the banks from whom VRA had gone to borrow, right? These were all not done. So what President Mahama is saying, these are things which I have done. And so I want you to listen to me. And moreover, I did them when we were in an IMF program, the 2015 IMF program. So, and I met you. He met them in Flagstaff House. He met them, the mission, and gave his personal commitment. And we went through them fairly well, because 2016, we ended with a deficit of 6.1. Debt on a new basis was 57, which is now over 100. So I think that he's saying that I have the record. And I think that an institution like the IMF, would definitely want to listen to him.
As we wrap up the conversation, I will refer you to a statement you just made. You say borrowing is inevitable, but then you're also clamping down on your internal generation methods that could help you with funds to run the government that you envisage.
No, we are boosting.
A key example is that you say you will scrap the e-levy, you will scrap the betting tax. These are revenue generating methods that this current administration put in place, which you're scrapping, meaning that you would be borrowing more. Why do that then if you know you need money to run the government?
Because once upon a time, I held a position as VAT's national coordinator. And once upon a time, there was a deputy minister called, His Excellency Mahama, Information Minister. And when the VAT was cancelled, he played a part in its reintroduction, right? And I can tell you that many of these taxes that we have reintroducing now, many of them used to exist, right? And we put all of them in the VAT. Why? Because if you have many taxes, it's difficult for GRA to administer. And then taxpayers start gaining. Because you need an army of people, to go and do audits and the rest. And your domestic tax system is not in place. So what he's saying is that even with all these taxes, our revenue is not doing any better. Until 2023, and subject to the data, the highest tax level that we collected, tax and revenue, was 2015, right? Despite all these levies and the rest, right? So what he's saying is that we have been here before. Many of these taxes were, on the best example I'll give you is the GET Fund and the NHIL. GET Fund and NHIL, GET Fund was introduced first as a means of introducing the VAT rate from 10% to 12.5%. NHIL, that was under President Rawlings. NHIL was introduced as a VAT under President Kufuor to increase the rate from 12.5% to 15%. And then because we wanted to do a lot of infrastructure, we had the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund, part of VAT, which was into 17.5. Today, the GET Fund and the NHIL have been taken from the VAT base, which means that an implication is that when you do VAT as a business and you pay VAT, you are not the consumer, right? So let's take this studio. When you pay VAT on your inputs, computer, stationery, and everything, you are not a consumer. Joy is not, multimedia is not a consumer, it's a business, right? So when you charge for advertisements and you add the VAT, you have to add VAT, right? You are allowed to deduct the VAT that you paid on your inputs because you are not the consumer. So it lightens your VAT burden. When we took them out, we blocked the credit and the refund by business, right? And it became less efficient because then they had to add it to cost. It's causing inflation and the rest. President Mahama, he said that I have the experience from the PNDC era. This thing, is a real nuisance. So when we want to streamline it. And let me give you the last as I say. When you put, I have a table, maybe less I would. When you put about 18 of these levies, including NHIL, even the communication service tax and the rest, they don't amount to more than 4% of our total tax collection or total revenue, which means that they have become an impediment to efficient tax compliance and collection. So those are the things he's saying that, yes, we have to do them, not some of them immediately. COVID. COVID was brought in back. COVID is over, right? But because of the fiscal situation, we cannot take it out. In the past, there were two levies, the fiscal stabilization levy and the temporary imports levy. We brought them in when we were doing IMF program. After the IMF program, they lapsed. They are still there, right? So he's saying that, and that makes it even more difficult when you face another crisis. Because you have the old one there, and then you keep increasing. So there's a precedent to many of what we are talking about. Yes, will it affect revenue immediately? It will, but not if you bring in the ITAX, the domestic tax system, as quickly as possible, to also, begin to check non-compliance and the rest, and to boost revenue. You may end up in a neutral position before you increase the revenue. Yeah.
My guest in the studio, Seth Terkper, he's former finance minister. He has served on 2 transition teams, and today we're just looking at the dynamics for the new government. You're watching NewsX. We'll be back. Please stay tuned in. Staying with us here on the Joy News channel. My guest in the studio is Seth Terkper, former finance minister, and we're just coming to him for his final words, but we have run out of time. I'm wondering, would the current IMF deal run concurrently with the new proposals that this new government is making, or will the current deal be truncated? That's a question I wanted him to answer, but unfortunately, I'm told we have run out of time. My name is Faustina.
Which will be the same program.
It will
be
still
the same program with modifications.
Okay. So he says it will be the same program. That's how I'll wrap up the conversation. For more news, please log on to myjoyonline.com. Good morning.